How's the market? Don't say that. Anyway, I was really excited to see the Altos research stuff, just because I think the data is so important. I do get to work with the C.A.R. Strategic Planning Committee every year, which is so much fun, and as you probably know, we read a lot of books. So the latest book that we had everyone read was I can't remember the title, but it's the Zillow book. What's it called? New Rules of Real Estate or something like that. So I just finished it. And has anyone here read it? You know, I just thought it would be interesting to hear what these guys have to say. And it's kind of a book that's directed towards consumers. And it's about, I mean, it's like soup to nuts. You know, it's like what language plays best in a listing, how oceanfront properties sell for so much more, why national flood insurance is not a good idea, why the mortgage interest deduction is not a good idea, why you definitely need a realtor. I like that chapter. But if anyone reads it, I'd love to know like what you thought, you know, because they kind of reference a lot of data. But the thing I think we know about data is what? It can tell different stories, right? What kind of a spin are you gonna put on it? So anyway, I'm gonna leave a copy of this presentation to go on the association's website. It will be posted on our website later today. So just sit back and, this is a small group, so let's dialogue. I tend to go fast sometimes just because I don't want people to fall asleep, so I'm happy to discuss stuff. But I wanted to start with just something you may not know about. We've, for the last 3 years, have had and this is kind of one of those terms that is overused now, but a thought leadership effort at C.A.R. to kind of elevate our brand in the world of academia and thought leaders. And so one of the things that has come of that is a new website that was launched this year. It's the Center for California Real Estate. We've done a couple of really excellent kind of papers, roundtables where Joel has interviewed some of the top MLS people, for example. I actually did one last month with 4 economists from all over the nation. The Jonathan Smoke, the chief economist with Realtor.com. Anyway, so there's that kind of stuff. So I just want you to know it exists. So if one night at 3 a.m. you can't get to sleep, you could kind of check it out. But one of the things that I think is really, really terrific is that we have partnered with an organization called the Futures Company, which you may have heard of. They partner with Ford Motor Company. I do not know how Anne Framrose did this, but we have access to this incredible library of consumer trends, infographics. So if you have a website that you want to differentiate yourself from other people, if you do monthly emails or hard copy things, there's just a lot of great, fun, easy to digest, reflects well on your knowledge of data for stuff, for stuff that you can use. So anyway, I just want to let you know about it. That's really my only ad this morning, and it's free as part of your membership. Okay, let's get started with, I'm just going to do a little macro stuff, and then we'll get into the California housing market and your local market. So we're on track this year for a GDP, an economic growth that's going to be maybe just a tad higher than it was last year, about 2.5%. We had a very slow first quarter. Cold weather had a little bit to do with that. We bounced back. In the second quarter. So I guess I would look at this entire recovery that we've had, and this is the annual data. This is the quarterly data. So if you look at the bottom right in 2009, where the economy shrank by almost 3.5%, and you look at the annual data, what you see is nothing that looks like a V-shaped recovery, right? We have just been kind of moderately growing, right? It's been a little bit long and disappointing. In fact, I don't even think we should call it a recovery anymore, because it seems to me like by the 6th year, this is kind of it, right? We're kind of back. So the economy's doing okay, and why this is important for us to know about is that the Fed is looking at the economy and gauging when they are going to start rates rising, right? So they're being patient. They're going to make a data-driven decision. So every month as the data points start coming out, those are being fed into the Fed, and they're going to decide when it's likely to go. So right now the consensus is September for sure, but who knows, right? I mean, nobody knows for sure. One of the things they look at very carefully also is the unemployment rate. Do you remember for the first couple of years of the recovery, it was 6%? Because we were way up there, right? So they were saying, you know, when we get to 6% or below, that's going to be great. Well, we've actually been there for quite a while. U.S. data, so the June unemployment rate was 5.3%. California 6.3%. We've been coming down since the peak in 2010. So that looks really good, except one of the questions I frequently get asked is, boy, 5.3%, it seems like it's a lot worse, and it is. So the number that's in the headlines is defined as U3, and unemployment 3 takes out people that are discouraged. It doesn't count people that are working part-time that want to be working full-time. It doesn't take people in retail that want to be teachers, right, underemployed. So if you do that, the actual unemployment rate, U6, which takes all of those issues into consideration, is about twice as high as U3. So again, data, what's the data? Well, let's dig a little deeper and see. But all that being said, the trend is the same, but it's just been tough. And this is really the key to understanding this recession. We had jobs lost because of a cyclical downturn in the economy, but we had jobs lost because of the structural changes taking place because of technology and because of outsourcing, right? So if you dig deeper and look at single female heads of households, that's a much higher unemployment rate. You look at white males over the age of 55, that's a much higher unemployment rate. There are people that in the recovery remain disenfranchised because that's just not where the job creation is. Now, California is the fastest growing state in terms of employment, second only to Texas, right? Second only to Texas. But in terms of sheer numbers, we are the biggest. The fastest growing employment region in California is the Bay Area. And this is the area that just scares me to death because their housing prices are crazy. Their inventory is non-existent, and yet they're also the one place in the state where there is significant income growth, right? Where there's significant income and job growth. So the fastest growing MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas in California, are San Jose and San Francisco. You know, I have been doing this for a while, and I remember when San Francisco was the financial center of the West Coast, and that people commuted into San Francisco from other parts of the Bay Area to work in the financial district. And today, San Francisco is essentially a bedroom community of Silicon Valley, right? Where you want to live in San Francisco. I mean, the young kids don't really want to live in Atherton or Palo Alto, right? They want to be in the Mission, they want to be in the Marina, and take the buses down. So it's kind of, everything is just kind of flip-flopped, you know, it's interesting. Fastest growing job category, construction. And that's very encouraging. You know, we quit building for 4 or 5 years. I'll have that slide for you later. And now building is back. We need a lot more construction in California, but that's the number one. Now, if you go down about 2/3 of the way, you see real estate rental and leasing. In May, that was a year-over-year gain of about 2.4%. And I will, in full disclosure, tell you that our membership forecast, and my group has to do that for the Strategic Planning Committee every year, we have been off for the last 5 years. We have gotten more members than we thought we would. More members than we thought we would. So this industry is full of contradictions. You know, it's, what is Pareto's Law? Pareto's Law is 80% of the transactions being done by 20% of the realtors. Well, it's probably 90-10 or even 95-5 in some areas. You have a lot of unproductive agents, and then you have a few very productive agents, and then a few people in between. But I think everybody's got hope, right? So you can always shake the family tree and get, you know, the people that don't have a choice. They're your blood relative. They're going to use you. But, you know, and a lot of people think this is an easy thing to do, right? So they get in, and what happens? It's really hard what you do. It's really, really hard. So anyway, we've been surprised. We're happy. It's kind of like the health club model. Sign up, don't show up. That's perfect. So we've got a lot of people that are paying dues that aren't really doing deals. But we have a philosophy at C.A.R. that we want to always represent the agent in the field who is actively pursuing a career in the industry. It's the people that are actually doing the transactions that we want to focus on. Here's a look midway through the year. Employment growth in California about 3%. I like to talk a lot about jobs just because the long-term sustainability of the housing sector depends on job growth. Right, because job growth is associated with household formation and with income growth, right? And those are the major components of demand, of the demand for housing. Just to illustrate how unique and horrible this last downturn was. So every colorful U that you see on this slide represents a post-World War II economic cycle. And each one bottoms out at the peak of the job losses. And it hits the x-axis again when all of the jobs lost have been replaced. Right, so it's a measure of how deep was it in terms of job losses, and how long did it take until we were whole again with replacing those jobs. And I probably don't need to tell you that the one at the bottom is what we just went through. It took 4 years longer. It was last year that we finally replaced all the jobs that were lost. So that's kind of what I was referring to earlier. Okay, consumer confidence. So this is an interesting measure. It comes from the Conference Board. They interview 5,000 households every month, and they ask them questions about how they're doing today and what their plans are for the future. You know, will you have a different job? Are you going to buy a house? Are you going to buy a car? How are you doing right now? And, you know, it bottomed out when the economy bottomed out in the beginning of 2009. And if you drew a regression line, you can see that it's definitely improved, but it's very volatile. And I think the volatility is related to two things. This economy is very personal for people. Everybody, as far as I can tell, knows someone who wants to work but hasn't been able to find a spot that matches their expectations, or has a college graduate living back at home again, those kinds of issues. And we also live in a 24/7 news cycle, right? It's almost too much information out there. So there's a lot of kind of give and take. So in general, consumers are feeling better. They're more optimistic, but it ebbs and flows with any given month. So it went up in June. It came back down in July. I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, some of this is weather. Some of it is oil prices. Some of it is, oh my goodness, what's happening to Greece and how is it going to impact me? Just people are very kind of sensitive about that. The consumer price index has been really almost zero for most of 2015. If you take out food and energy, it's still running below 2%. So what's going on? One of the questions I've gotten over the years has been, boy, the Fed has really been pumping reserves into the system. We're going to see a hyperinflation. It's going to be crazy. This is awful. And then you look at the actual data, and there's no inflation in sight, unless you're not happy with 2%, in which some people are not. So one of the ways, let me kind of jump ahead here to understand what's happened, is when we almost had a global financial catastrophe collapse, the Fed stepped in and made the major banks take reserves. And if they had loaned those reserves, had used those reserves to make loans and expand the money supply, we might be looking at higher inflation today, but they didn't. This is a chart of excess reserves. These are reserves held by depository institutions over and above what they are required to hold by law, right? Their capital requirements. Excess reserves were zero until the fall of 2008. Zero. And then when the Fed proactively sought to kind of calm things down, it started to go up. So that's the answer to your question that you may not have formulated yet, but these reserves are not being used. There's a lot more lending capability in the system today. And in fact, I think one of the things that from the vantage point of doing this for a while, one of the things I always think is, wow, we talked about a global real estate market, but we're living in it, right? What happens in China impacts us, and the same thing with the capital markets. And I think one of the things to think about is just in terms of demographics. You've got baby boomers, with many of them have lots of money saved for retirement, believe it or not. And globally, you've got a lot of cash. I don't know what the number is, but every day there's another couple hundred millionaires in China. There's almost a glut of capital. Capital is not scarce, right? You've got a lot of capital looking for return, and the only place to put it the last few years has been real estate or the stock market, right? There hasn't really been a lot of other places to go. Looking at the rate environment, I think 30 years are around 4% right now, something like that. So the rate environment is good. I would argue that credit availability is still constrained. We've got underwriting today that is much tighter than it was in the year 2002, 2001, before things got crazy. I hope someday someone in the mortgage industry will explain to me why at the peak of the market in 04, 05, 06, you could be dead and get a mortgage. And at the bottom of the market, when prices, and I understand hindsight's 20/20, but at the bottom of the market, when you kind of know that prices are can only go up, it's hard to get a mortgage. Like, what is that about? That's just so counterintuitive to me. So anyway, so the issue, with respect to rates is, so the Fed's going to start raising the Fed funds rate at some point this year. I mean, I think they've signaled it over and over. We're going to see that. And I think I mentioned to you, I had a roundtable of really smart PhD economists, much more brighter and more financial than I am. And I asked them all, what impact will higher rates have on the housing market? And you know what they said? Very little. Very little. They don't see rates going up that much. And to the extent that they do, it just isn't going to be that big a factor, because right now it's not the level, it's the underwriting underneath it. So for whatever that's worth. Okay, so anyway, this year, as I mentioned, we're on track for about a 2.5% increase in economic growth. Next year, and I'll be doing my forecast in San Jose at our expo in October, but just to give you a preview, and again, these numbers aren't final, but a little bit stronger growth the following year. Job growth about 2.2% this year. Unemployment rate down beautifully. CPI 0.6% because of the low oil prices, and that's starting to change a little bit. We've seen the all-time lows already. Disposable income U.S., and it's even growing much faster in California. California is like 4.3, and rates about 4.1%. And then here's a look at the California data with stronger growth, lower unemployment, disposable income up 4.3%. So there's that. And for the overall U.S. housing market, which I think is relevant to all of us just because people look at that and go, well, how does California compare? Right? So one of the things you can see really clearly is the median home price in the U.S. looks nothing like some of the ones that you're dealing with, right, on the coast at 220. And existing single-family home sales up this year and up next year. And I'll give you the California one in a minute. How are we doing? I asked you all, and you were very optimistic, and I love that. Year to date, we're actually up 7.1% in terms of closed escrows of existing single-family homes in California. In fact, we've had a really good year. It would be even better if we had more inventory. That's really been the big constraint on the market. In July, we were almost at an annual pace of 450,000, which is the fastest pace we've seen since about 2012, something like that. I mean, it's been a good market. There's not much distressed property, but there is some. So I wanted to just give you the latest stats. In fact, over 90% of the sales are traditional equity, non-distressed. But for those that aren't, as of August 19th, there were 5,940 properties in LA County where there had been an NDA, a notice of default, filed. There were 3,949 properties where an auction date had been set. Yes, as of August 19th. So it's point in time, right now. And there are 5,294 bank-owned properties. And if you saw the CoreLogic release, things have come up a little bit. I mean, nothing like what we saw. I think these are more normal variations. But one of the things I'm hearing is that we're seeing problems with reverse mortgages. I don't know if any of you have encountered that, but a short sale due to a reverse mortgage. So I think that's something that's really important that people understand. Despite the fact that the Fonz is telling you this is a good thing to do, you might want to look a little bit more carefully. In Torrance right now, just to get super local, there are about 45 properties for sale that are REO bank owned. In Redondo Beach, there are 11. And in San Pedro, there are 44. So, much smaller than we saw, for sure, but still there. Okay, what's happening with prices? Well, we're seeing annual appreciation around 5%. I'm very happy with that. 2 years ago, the annual appreciation was above 20%. That got me a little nervous. We started to see a slowing in the rate of appreciation in the middle of 2013 when rates went up. And I won't go back to that slide, but there was about a 1% increase over a couple of months that summer. And we call that the taper tantrum. So that was the Fed tapering off their bond buying program. They actually didn't start it. They started talking about it, right? So that was absorbed by the market participants, and in a relatively short period of time, rates went up, and that turned our market down in terms of the rate of appreciation. And as I've noted, I think that's been a very good thing. And here you can see it. So this looks at the year-over-year appreciation, and you can see it peaking, the most recent peak being the middle of 2013 and coming down to where we are now, which is about a 5% year-over-year increase. So, if you have clients kind of asking what's happening to prices, looking at the Altos Research Report, looking at the stuff that we do, don't have it ever be your opinion. Rely on the data and provide them with enough data sources that they can figure out what's going on. You can also see the slowdown, the flattening in the price per square foot, which I noticed in Manhattan Beach is $1,000. So for the state as a whole in July, it was $228, and it's been flat for the past 5 months, price per square foot. One of the very positive things about the appreciation that we have seen is that the number of underwater mortgages in the state has dropped significantly. So it peaked in the fourth quarter of 2009 with 35% of the mortgages in the state were negative. And today it's 8.5% with another 1.9 kind of on the edge. So that's been helpful. And one of the things I find most encouraging about that is that it means more people have an option to consider selling. And we really want to figure out how to shake more inventory loose. People today, on average, are staying in their home 20 years. Yes. And that's one of the problems. Current homeowners, and I'll talk more, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but yeah, we'll talk about that. Inventory in July was about a 3.3 month supply on the market. That's about a half what you would consider normal, and this is just the ratio of listings to sales. So it says that in July, at the rate property was selling, you would be out of inventory in 3.3 months. And I know for some of your markets, you'd be happy with that, right? Because you're even lower than that. This is really interesting, and it shows you kind of a little more detail on the dynamics of the market. So in July in Southern California, sales increased 18% year over year. Active listings dropped 4%. Bay Area, sales up 5, active listings down 13. Only in the Central Valley do you have both moving in the same direction. So that explains a lot. Here's kind of a more detailed look. LA County, which obviously we're a part here, sales up 14, listings down 3. San Diego, active listings down 12. San Bernardino, still in recovery, one of the only affordable areas really in Southern California, with active listings up as well as sales. Because typically when prices go up, it encourages existing homeowners to sell, and that's not happening. So where is the inventory? Well, we talk a lot about first-time homebuyer affordability issues. I would contend that there's an affordability issue faced by current homeowners. And it has to do with they have a terrific mortgage. 4% now, you know what it was a couple years ago? 3, under 3. So they're locked into like, wow, I'm going to redo my kitchen. I'm not going to give up that mortgage. We have Prop 13 in California. We all love Prop 13, but it distorts the market, right? It's why would you want to leave that? I do not understand why more counties don't allow the transfer of the basis when you're dealing with a senior citizen. Yeah, above 60. Prop 60 and Prop 90, right? I heard a wonderful speech years ago by the county assessor of San Diego, who I think on the side is a stand-up comedian. I mean, he was so funny. And one of the things he said is, why wouldn't we welcome these people, right? They're retired, they volunteer, they don't use the school system, and they don't use the criminal justice system, right? Like, it's like a win-win. Like, I'll take a little less on the property taxes because it's a net gain. So I think we need to get that word out, right? Everybody knows there's no listings, right? So why would you sell your home for a high price in a short amount of time when there's nowhere to go? Like, your dream home's not on the market. And then fourth, how many current homeowners could not qualify for a mortgage with the current underwriting, right? They're stuck, right? Even though they have perfect credit. I mean, I can't tell you how many friends of mine are realtors. Perfect credit, pay every bill on time, can't get a mortgage. Okay, foreclosures, there are not a lot of foreclosures. Investors, this is starting to change, but investors were renting properties out instead of flipping them, particularly in the first few years of the recovery. New construction is still off. And then we have this phenomena of off MLS listings, which may mean my data is meaningless. I'm not sure. I talk about this partly because it is irritating to not have everything in the MLS. for me personally as an economist. But I think in terms of the fiduciary duty to the client, it's really bad. It's really not a good idea not to support the MLS. I mean, this is what kind of what do they say about accessorizing is what separates us from the animals or something? I mean, the MLS is what separates us from the commercial industry, for example. I mean, this is about sharing. It's about cooperation. And I think pockets, which tend to be predominantly double ending, is just a bad idea. And the idea that a seller, I mean, I understand if it's Brad Pitt, but other than Brad, the idea that you can get a higher price for your home by not having as many people look at it, it just defies logic. So that's just my personal opinion. So where are we? You know, the housing market is okay, but it's underperforming the fundamentals of job growth, income growth, the return of household formation, and the level of rates, right? We aren't seeing the level of transactions that I would have predicted in a model based on the fundamentals that we have. First-time buyers ought to be 10% more of the market than they are, and affordability is a big issue for them. You know, we've also talked in the past about the rental market and affordability and lack thereof in the rental market. So a friend of mine worked for Freddie. He's back at Freddie, moved his family back to Orange County. He's renting. He kept being bid out. He couldn't get a rental, and his realtor said, okay, we need a package. We need your credit score. We need a letter. We need photos. We need a really good story just to get a rental in Orange County. I'd never heard that before. I was just like, wow, this is really not good. Okay, let me, just a couple of things. Now, every year for the last 35 plus years, we have done a survey of realtors in June of every year, asking them about their last closed transaction. So we have just gotten the results back. I'm going to kind of highlight all of them in the speech I give in October in San Jose. But I just wanted to give you a flavor for how that data kind of helps us gauge where we are in the market. So one of the questions we ask is, you know, your last transaction, were there multiples and how many? So 2013 was the peak of the market in terms of the intensity looked at in terms of multiples. So in 2013, and this was June, 72% of the realtors said, I had multiples in my last transaction. The following year, last year, it was only 53%. Average number of multiples went from 5.7 to 4.3. So still a lot, but not what it was, you know, kind of gauging that pulse of the market. In 2013, 50% of the properties sold for above ask, and last year it was 33%. And I am a little confused about this because I know some of my friends, and this particularly up in Silicon Valley, tell me that they have to underprice the property in order to get interest, and then they have all of these multiples and it sells for $300,000 over list. Yes? This is the whole state of California. No, well, this is California. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is why everybody still needs a realtor. It's all about the local data. Now, I would argue, I think fairly convincingly, that this trend is, because every area I go to says, Leslie, we're unique. We are unique. So I will just say, you are unique, absolutely. And I mean that. Manhattan Beach is not Pasadena. But in general, everybody had the tightest possible year in 2000. I mean, the most intensity in the market demand was in 2013, and it wasn't as intense. And that's the only point I'm trying to make. And I think the more that you can localize your data, and Altos does a great job of that, there are other people too, I think it's very important to do so. Do you know what the multiple offer was for this area? No, and it wouldn't be, we mail out, email out, send out 15,000 surveys, and we get 900 responses. So if I told you Manhattan Beach, it'd probably be 4 people. It wouldn't be statistically significant. You know, so one of the things you guys could do is do a survey just of your board and say you get a free breakfast if you fill this out, and then you might get enough data points to make a difference. And sometimes you can, you know, go into the MLSs and see, you know, what was the, you know, list price, what was the sale price, and do those kinds of calculations, which we do for large areas. I don't have the staff to do it for every little area, but you guys can do that. So there are ways to get more local data. But I agree with your point 100%. You know, we're the statewide organization, and we're limited by how many people answer our surveys. We also asked realtors, was your buyer an investor? And in 2013, 19% of the realtors said yes, and the next year it was 2014, and this makes a lot of sense, right? The easy money in real estate, I think, has been made already, the easy money, right? And so investors were a dominant part of the market in 08, 09, 2010, 2011, because it was all on the upside, right, in terms of price appreciation. I think we've kind of, and again, there are exceptions to every rule, but you know, there's just less upside right now. The other thing that's interesting is that in 2013, 82% of the investors were going to rent the property out. A year later, only 70%. So there was an increase in flipping from 18 to 30% because, right, as prices have risen, that's really like get in, fix it up, and get it back on the market. And that's where they were able to get a quicker return. So I'm very thankful for the investors in real estate. They are the canary in the coal mines. These are the people that were buying property in the Central Valley in 2008, and people thought they were crazy. Right, I was at a program yesterday. I don't know how many of you know Bruce Norris of the Norris Group, but he buys a lot of properties out in the Inland Empire, and he had data on one particular property that he bought in 2000. That I think its last sale price was $350. He bought it in 09 for $63,000. He's been renting it out the last 6 years, and it's back on the market now for even more than it, well, not as much, not the 350, but I think 275 or something like that. You know, still, yeah. So they're, what? Not a bad profit, and he does that all over the country. You know, he's doing that in Florida now, because Florida has a 4-year, it takes 4 years to foreclose in Florida. So they're kind of like we were in 2011. So let me just kind of go through the July data from Claris Market Metrics from the MLSs. So Torrance, 129 units closed escrow last month. Median home price up 16.9% year over year at $625. 350 units for sale and 1.8 months of inventory. And when you download the data, the slide, the Claris Market Metrics defines inventory a little bit. They calculate a little differently than we do, so their numbers are a little lower than ours. But I put it down at the bottom so you can compare, whatever. Redondo Beach, 109 units closed escrow in July. Median price, $885. 228 units for sale. 1.4 months of inventory. San Pedro, 70 units in July. Median set for, I mean, that looks cheap, right? 475, let's go. 223 units for sale and 2.1 months of inventory. And we're seeing this all over coastal California. Absolutely, this is not unique. This is the market that California is experiencing 6 years into the quote-unquote recovery. So I just want to say a couple of things about housing affordability. It's bad. It's going to get a lot worse. We are going to see an exodus of millennials out of California because they simply can't afford to get a foothold in the housing market. If you adjust the California and U.S. median home prices and just have it all in 2014 prices and go back to 1970, the U.S. median home price was 10 grand below the California median. So I kind of call that the California premium, right? That was what Californians paid to live in this amazing state. Today, that California premium, using annual data last year, $246,000. So what happened? I mean, you can see the housing crisis bubble experience, but this started to happen in the 70s and 80s as well. And so there's a couple things unique to California. And one of them has to do with the CEQA. You know, one of them has to do with NIMBYism, not in my backyard. One of them has to do with the fact that in California, existing homeowners have more control of new development than anywhere else in the country. And a refusal to adopt high-density development along transportation corridors, partly because they don't exist. So it's tough. I mean, there's a reason for the escalation of housing prices. And as the globalization of the California market continues, it's only going to get more difficult. So I think it is going to kind of precipitate this inland, the flyover states will be destination states as people look at, Colorado, Texas, Oregon as viable places. Yeah.
Something's got to give. This is just absurd. I'm absolutely disgusted looking at these numbers. And it's pure greed, and it's absolute stupidity that these people are just racing to buy at the absolute peaks that are not sustainable. There's no way in hell this is practical. It's not sustainable. The country has borrowed so much money that they're just printing money over and over and over, and we haven't even discussed that.
Well, I think one of the things that's you got to think about is what happens when there's a stock market correction, and are these tech companies really going to be able to maintain the growth and justify their valuations? I mean, not to pick on Zillow, but their valuation makes absolutely no sense, right? When you look at their revenues, I mean, no sense at all. Part of this has to do with artificially low rates, right? As I said, you've got a lot of capital. I think you've heard of the top 1%. There are people that are doing extremely well, have a lot of cash, and as I mentioned, there's two places for it to go with yield: real estate and the stock market. That's it. You also have this huge group of kind of international wealthy people that are doing the same thing, coupled with a state that doesn't build new units in coastal areas, right? It doesn't happen. There's no supply response. In other parts of the country, they build more. Henderson, Nevada is not having this problem.
Where did the rest of us that can't afford our own neighborhoods to even rent? We have to leave the state.
You have to leave the state. That's what I'm saying. There's going to be an exodus of people to more affordable areas because this is not going to get better. And it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And a part of it is this excess of capital, quote unquote, and part of it is our own attitudes, right, about public transportation and about high-density development. I mean, this isn't rocket science. There are cities in Asia in particular that are so far ahead of us with much higher populations that have figured out how to do this, right? But the rise in housing prices is really like pulling the drawbridge up, right? I've got mine, you're out of luck. And, you know, C.A.R. has always been a huge proponent and had a huge interest in housing affordability. And 20 years ago, we had a campaign, and the tagline is, "Where will our children live?" And that's really the key, is to make it personal for people. You know, where will it be? But again, this is very understandable given market dynamics. There's no supply response, you know, where people want to go. So, anyway.
I also want to address that a lot of the people, a lot of the millennials, a lot of the older 30 to 40, they're getting money from their parents. Their parents are rich.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are gifting their kids money, and this is where it's going.
Yeah, and they're using then they're using the equity in their home to do it at times, right?
That's where it's coming from.
So anyway, housing affordability peaked in the beginning of 2012, and it has come down sharply since then. In the first quarter of this year, 34% of the households in the state earned enough to buy the statewide median home price. The most affordable county was Kings County at 62%. I have actually been in Kings County recently. It's kind of go to Bakersfield, keep going, and turn left. And when you see a lot of cows, you're there. I'm not kidding. And then the U.S. affordability's right up there with Kings, right? 61%. The least affordables, San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Barbara, right? What did I hear about Santa Barbara 30 years ago? The people that live there don't work there, and the people that work there can't live there. Very sad. We put out a press release yesterday where we calculated the proportion of listings that were affordable. Right now in California, 28.5% of the actual listings are affordable to the median income household. In San Francisco, it's 2.1%. I can only imagine what that property looks like. Don't even want to go there. In Kings County, it's 67%. So that's kind of another way of looking at it. In Southern California, in LA County, 18.7%, much less than the state as a whole at the 28.5%. How much home can a typical household afford in LA County? $275,000. The median home price is $436,000. Right? I mean, it's a big problem. Here's a look at some wages in LA County. You need about a $90,000 income to buy the median priced home. So if you're a registered nurse or a software developer, you're fine, maybe. Yeah. But any of these other, computer programmer, firefighter, teacher, chef, auto mechanic, retail, you have got to find a friend or two or three, right, in order to make that happen. Median share of household income spent on housing. This was an analysis done out of Sacramento for 2013. In LA, it's 30%. In most major metro areas throughout the country, it's about 23%. So that's another part of it, right? A bigger chunk of income going to housing. And this is by income quartile. So for low-income households in California, they're spending over 65% of their monthly income on housing, right? For 65%. First-time home buyers. So this goes back to our annual survey of realtors. So we also asked, was your buyer a first-time home buyer? And last June, it was about 30% of you said, yes, I was working with a first-time home buyer. With rates this low, we ought to be at or above that long-run average, and we're not, because it is just very, very competitive for first-time buyers. They're competing with all cash, right? If you've got a loan, like you're not a desirable buyer, you know, when you're competing with all cash. The homeownership rate today is and looking at just the kind of, I think it was it was like 92 when President Clinton said we've got to get the homeownership rate up. Our homeownership rate today is below what it was when that initiative was started. Yes?
I wanted to add everyone in this room that's got their listings, that we actually have the ability to control Mr. Cash, put him in his place. I mean, why are we making the rich even richer? What are we doing?
Well, I think I'll just say, you know, the realtor has a fiduciary duty to their seller to get them the best possible. If a realtor's selling their own home and wants to make that kind of, we'll talk about it afterwards. I don't want to, yeah. Okay, I think the other issue, and I stressed this earlier, has to do with lack of supply. Just to remind you what it looks like when California builds, look at the mid-'80s. Right? So we have been well below the demographic demand of about 165,000 units a year for the past 7 or 8 years. And this year we'll come in at about around 100,000 units. About half of them are single family, half of them are multifamily, but there really is a huge gap. I mentioned a credit availability issue. And here's some data from CoreLogic and the Urban Institute. So back in 2000, 30% of the mortgages that were made in 2000 had a credit score under 660. Today it's 10%, right? So that's fine. The 660 to 750 has also dropped from around 40, whatever, I can't really do this well in my head, but look at the increase in the 750 or above, right? So again, if you are plain vanilla and fit into the square box, you're probably going to be just fine. But if you're not, you're going to have a devil of a time getting a mortgage. And the estimate from the Urban Institute, and Lori Goodman, who spent a lot of years on Wall Street and is now with the Urban Institute, calculated that we'd have about 1.5 million more mortgages today than we do if we just went back to the underwriting of 2002. Yes?
Regarding the FICO score of 660, I mean, who can get that loan? I mean, no one can get that loan unless you're FHA or something.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, good point, absolutely. I do want to tell you about our finance helpline. If you don't know about it, there's a number you can call at C.A.R. where we'll help you if your transaction hits a financing speed bump of some kind. So we have an ombudsman who has relationships with most of the major lenders in California, and it's a great program. Unfortunately, we're not reaching enough people, so we're hoping to ramp it up over the next 2 years, or we're going to have to discontinue it. But we really would love to save more transactions when there's a financing issue. We also have a tool on our website. It's a partnership with a organization called Workforce Housing, where you can just enter a little bit of info about the buyer and the home, and it'll tell you what programs are available that provide down payment resources. There's a lot of programs out there, and people just don't know about them. So if you ever did happen to be working with a first-time buyer, and not even, some of them doesn't even have to be a first-time buyer, check this out and put in the info and see what might be done. It's really good. These are government programs. They're local, regional, state, and national down payment assistance programs. So give your buyer money for a down payment, essentially. Okay, so the forecast for this year, after a 7.5% drop in sales last year, in 2014, largely because of no inventory, we're going to come in at slightly over 400,000 existing single-family home sales, or 800,000 sides, a 4.4% increase. The median home price, and we calculate it for the year as a whole, so we're above 470 right now, obviously, but for the year as a whole, we'll be about 470, which is a 5.3% increase. Housing affordability, 31%, and rates about 4.1. And our preliminary forecast for next year, which again, I'll go into detail in October, sales up 5.8, prices up 4.4, further deterioration in housing affordability, and rates about 4.5%. So again, for next year as a whole, this is what it looks like graphically. Dollar volume in our industry bottomed in 2013. So next year will be this 5th year in a row that it's gone up. So that's good. And then I just have two quick things before I end. We do a lot of surveys at C.A.R., and it's kind of our niche, if you will. And it's really interesting how unreported and undocumented our industry is. You know, you're used to, stock exchange, 10K, all that stuff, and people call me all the time for data that you think would be easy to get. How many Chinese buyers bought homes in California last year? I have no idea. Nobody fills out a form and sends it to C.A.R. and say, we're a Chinese buyer and we bought a home in California this year. So it's tough. So we do the best we can. So we do a survey where we ask California realtors if you had an international buyer in your last transaction, or I think this is in the last 12 months. So please tell us about your last closed transaction with an international client. What is your client's country of permanent residence? So of that group, and it's about 8% of our members, 8% saying, I had an international client. 35% were China, Hong Kong. Then Canada, Mexico, Japan, and India. Those round out the top 5 in terms of the actual country of origin. And I just brought a couple slides. There's a much bigger survey that you can get off our website. 30% were using the property as a primary residence, but 38% it was investment, 27% second home. And compare that with U.S. buyers where 91% were buying their primary residence. So very different kind of motivation. Then this is going back to the all cash. 69% of the international buyers paid all cash versus 27% of the traditional. And then the millennials, right? Who can tire of talking about the millennials? They're either our kids or someone else's kids or whatever. So we surveyed last year people ages 18 to 34, and we asked them, what is your current living situation? 41% were renters, 20% owned, and 36% lived with their parents. And this is the group that got launched into the labor market at just the wrong time, right? It was just the perfect storm of a declining economy. And so they essentially had to move back in with their parents, and we're starting to see that reverse itself, and they're leaving. So there's been a lot of talk about the millennials not valuing home ownership, not wanting home ownership, and I would say that is absolutely not true. But I'll get you in just a minute. I think what really is happening with the millennials is they've just delayed adulthood by about 8 years because they've had to. And coupled with that, their parents, the baby boomers, are incredibly codependent with this group. I cannot tell you how many of my friends had a senior or had a freshman go off to college, and after the first semester, they were back home. Honey, to me, the bad roommate your first year is like part of the deal. You have to have a horrible roommate so you appreciate your parents, So this codependence coupled with the economy really created a situation where they were welcomed back home. The parents got to kind of know what the latest music was and how to fix their computer and all that good stuff. So yes, your question. 18 to 34. Yeah, 18 to 34. Okay, so then we asked the people that had purchased a home, how would you describe your attitude towards the home buying process? 50% of them had a positive experience and 50% didn't. So, you can't escape the word disruption today, right? It's the latest buzzword. Everybody's getting disrupted, right? Great. The disruptions happen when there's a void like this, when there's a degree of dissatisfaction. And I think that's something we all need to kind of take seriously. And it seems like the biggest trigger point in the real estate transaction has to do with financing. It's scary. It's tough. So one of the questions we asked is, could you obtain a mortgage if you applied now? And 45% said they did not know. And to me, that's something that ought to be part of financial literacy. A couple of months ago, the Sunday New York Times had an editorial on housing. And they said that for households without inherited wealth, home ownership is the primary vehicle for wealth creation during their, that's how important it is. So then Guarantee Mortgage did this survey, you probably saw it already, where they talked to people who had gotten a loan, and 23% of them said they would rather gain 10 pounds than go through that process again. All right, so you can see this is very serious. 12% would rather spend 24 hours with someone they don't like. 7% would rather either get a root canal or go to prison so for a night. So, this is very funny, but I think it also points to something that needs to be fixed, and I'm sure you've all heard the joke. I don't tell it very well, but it's like getting a mortgage versus, buying a Maserati for $250,000, and how you can be driving out the door of the auto dealer literally in an hour, and you can actually take the car to Mexico, whereas you're buying a $70,000 home in Hemet, it's going to take you, 2 months, and the home's not going to move, right? It's like there. So this is one of the things that's happening with Zillow and .loop, if you guys are familiar with that. And one of my friends, Rob Hahn, who writes the Notorious Rob blog, and I like Rob a lot, even though politically and in a lot of ways we're very different. And he's saying, before Zillow bought .loop, nobody was talking about privacy with respect to the transaction. I said, Rob, I beg to differ. C.A.R., which you probably know, owns ZipForms, owns the majority stake in ZipForm, right? That's why it's a free member benefit. They're located outside of Detroit. A number of companies in California did arrangements with .loop, and they wanted to get off forms. And we said, absolutely not. Because if you read the fine print, who owns the data in the forms? They do. Why is the data in the forms so valuable? It's private data, right? But it's very valuable data because how many brokers make most of their revenue off selling homes, commission, just that bucket? Very little, right? Isn't it like $150 net or something? I mean, it's really low. They're making money off ancillary services, right? It's the loan, it's the title, whatever it is. So this kind of opens up this whole possibility that all of this data is going to be available to Zillow. So I don't want to supercharge this issue. I just want you to understand what the issue is and why it is such a big deal. I mean, the software is beautiful and all that. Now, Spencer Raskoff has described what happens. Okay, so Zillow owns search. We'd probably agree with that, right? They're the first consumer real estate brand, right? You want to find a home, you're going to Zillow, right? But once you get into contract, it is the realtor who is contract to close. And that's the part that Zillow is interested in. Obviously, they're going to have to be very careful because their revenue model essentially depends on you paying them for leads and advertising, right? But that's what they are interested in doing, and Spencer calls this paper pushing. The paper pushing that is involved going from contract to close should be automated, bump, 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 you're done. But that's not the way the world works, and that's the value that the realtor brings to the transaction. So read about this, don't take my word for it, but understand that this is a tipping point for the future of our industry. And I think the issues about privacy, and what I said to Rob Hahn is, Rob, au contraire, 2 years ago, C.A.R. made a big deal about privacy and protecting the data in the forms. This isn't just now with Zillow buying .loop. Yes?
Do you have an opportunity to communicate with the local MLSs like we are with C.A.R. MLS?
Of course.
And they are partnering with Zillow, and I'm still trying to figure it out if it's a good idea or not. And I'm just curious if you have an opportunity to share.
Oh yeah, they're part of all of these discussions. And listen, I'm sure there are people in this room that are Zillow Premier agents, that people here that are paying money to Zillow every month. I mean, there's, it's not clear where we stand. There's no clear position because there's a lot of differences of opinion. Some people run a business model based on Zillow leads, right? I mean, their latest earnings call, Zillow said there was, was this huge percent increase in the number, and they didn't give the number, which drives me nuts. They gave the percentage change, but in the share of agents that are spending $5,000 a month or more with Zillow. And those are the ones they're going after. They don't care about the guys that are doing 1 or 2 a year, right? They want that group. So anyway, this is just a brief look at some of the books that we've read at the Strategic Planning Committee this year. Big Money. Sandy, where are you? Sandy did a great job of talking about how important being politically involved and writing a check is, and this book explains why. Post-Citizens United. Pre-Citizens United, the Realtor PAC was pretty powerful. Post-Citizens United, it's not, right? When an individual can write a 7-figure, $100 million check to a super PAC, it's very different. So grassroots involvement is important, but voluntary contributions are more important than ever. For those of you that like leadership books, Ed Catmull, one of the founders of Pixar, has just written one of the best leadership books I have ever read, and I can't recommend it more, and he's just such a mensch. He's such a great guy, and he, one of the kind of themes or big chunks of the book is talking about Toy Story, and how he said every movie that Pixar has ever done started out horrible, awful, and what the process was like and the teamwork that essentially created these masterpieces. It's a lovely book. 0 to 1, Peter Thiel, you probably recognize his name. He was one of the founders of PayPal. He runs a $1 billion VC firm in Silicon Valley. This book is based on a series of lectures he gave at Stanford on startups. And just to spend a few hours with someone who is so smart, and I don't want to say he's right about everything, but he's just smart, and he has a vision, and he just he's talking about Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs came out with that very first, what did they call it? Just the music thing? Yeah. I mean, that wasn't what he was thinking about. He was all the way at the iPad. He was all the way over here, and just how the visionaries think. The Innovators was the book that is about the computer, the evolution of the computer. And Walter Isaacson was actually working on this book when Steve got really sick, and Steve said, "Will you please come and write my biography?" And he did, and then he got back to the Innovators. And it's just a wonderful look at not only the, Gates and Jobs way back when, but also Charles Babbage, and Ida Lovelace, who was Lord Byron's daughter. Her mother was a mathematician. She was a mathematician, and she got it, what these mathematical machines could do. And if you ever get up to Silicon Valley, I highly recommend going to the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. It's very close to the Google campus, and they even have Charles Babbage's machine, and they do a demo, and it works. I mean, it's like crazy. It works. But you see the whole history. It just was, our strat planning committee did it. It was great. And then the new rules of real estate with Zillow is a very quick read, short chapters. But I just wanted to see what Spencer and Stan were going to say about us. And then finally, we're trying to get a little lighter with some of our questions at C.A.R. just because, the gain 10 pounds just always was such a winner. So we did a recent survey, and then we provided all of these pictures of kind of classical home styles and asked what their dream home was. And the winner was the Craftsman Bungalow, which I don't think is a surprise for California, right? And the loser was the brick urban row house that looks right out of Philadelphia. Having lived there, I totally support the findings of this survey. We also asked, and again, we made a mistake. We should have asked pick one instead of multiple answers. But we said, in which of the following activities would you like to participate? Select all that apply. And the biggest net was stay home with family and friends, which is great. The smallest net was Burning Man. And so I have instructed my staff to do a cross-tab on Burning Man because I want to see who these people are, what they're like, and what they're doing.
Can you go back to that, the houses?
Yeah. So we've got neo-colonial, 19%, had that as their dream. The Dream Mansion, 14. Frank Lloyd Wright, 12. Desert Modern, 8.5. Art Nouveau, Art Modern, 57%. Modern Townhome, 5.1. Downtown Loft, 2.6. Brick Urban.
Funny how Mediterranean's not up there anymore.
The Mediterranean has died, huh?
We can put Mediterranean in. You're out. That's a good point. And Spanish for California too, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, our survey guy's from Illinois, so I think he did okay considering, but those are good points. Very good suggestions. Okay. Our research is on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We have a Flipboard account, so if you do the Flipboard magazines, you could subscribe and see what we're reading at C.A.R., and we have a Housing Matters blog. So there's all kinds of ways to follow us.
And how do we get the PowerPoint?
I'm going to leave a flash drive here, so it's going to be posted on the board website, and it will be posted on C.A.R.org under market data. And if you have a big enough, if you can take the size of the file, you can email me, leslie@C.A.R.org, and I'll send it to you when I get back this afternoon. Yes?
That's the one thing I didn't hear you talk about, which is, a lot of realtors don't like to talk about it, but if you're more of an investor, you do very interested. Every market obviously has a peak or a bubble burst. How far out do you think we are from the next bubble burst?
I don't know. If I had to give an answer, I'd say 5 or 6 years. I think it really depends on how strong the tech sector stays for how long, right, and how quickly people move out of state. But nobody knows. I mean, that's a really important question to think about. But given how slow this recovery has been, I don't see it like popping overnight. You know what I mean? We're still seeing good growth in the economy. We're seeing a revival of household formation. Our income growth is good. The job growth is good. But anything can happen. I mean, and that's the thing. There's all these exogenous events outside of our system that could create big changes. I mean, listen, the Bay Area is the only area in the state where we have prices above where they were in '05.
Are we there now here?
No.
Big cities?
No. Yeah, well, in the beach cities you may be, yeah. Yeah.
Look at,
I can't remember off the top of my head, but for the region as a whole, it's the Bay Area. But down here, like the Inland Empire is still well below where they were, for example. So it's kind of like a water balloon, you know, you're going out. Yeah.
You know, driving this one, listen, the stock market's down to 300 points today, and looks like this is the fourth day in a row. If we would see, let's say, a 10% correction in the stock market, what do you think that would do to real estate over the next year?
I think it would slow. I think it would just kind of shatter confidence, create uncertainty, people not knowing what's going to happen. And even though, you know, the stock market goes up and people count all that as their wealth, and it comes down like this, it's like, I lost all this money. Well, actually, that wasn't really real money, right? But psychologically, it was. So it would be a damper on the market for sure, in my view. But it'd have to be more than just what we're seeing now. It'd have to be bigger. Yes? Right.
And you mentioned that the economist saying that won't happen to South Bay Area or the area we are at right now. Is there any literature that you have or you can tell us that we can refer these people? I'm trying to email them things from lenders. They say, no, it won't happen. But I don't want them to take my word.
Well, why don't you email me, and when it's done, we will have a roundtable that I did with the 4 economists I mentioned, and they got into that issue and maybe I could even have our communications department do an excerpt, but it's still in a transcript form right now. But if you email me at leslie.a@car.org, I won't forget, and I'll get you something, you know, and maybe we'll do an article on it.
Yeah, that would be great because I work with right now 8 groups, buyers, first-time buyers, people they sold in the valley, bringing the money, cash buyers, and they wrote offers and ridiculous offers that was insulting to people, the sellers, but they are believing who want to wait for the interest rate to go higher.
Okay.
I'm trying to convince them that won't happen.
Right.
It will not have so much effect in Palos Verdes area.
Right.
The prices are not going to drop that much.
No, well, there's no supply and tons of demand, but email me. Okay, that would be great. Yes?
Is the election next year it's got to take effect in some way in this market?
Who knows? You know, this comes up every election, right? And then, does anybody remember anything dramatic happening because of before or after the election? Although, I mean, if Trump wins, I think there will be a huge exodus of people out of the country, so I don't know. We'll see. I don't know how to respond to that. Yeah, I mean, then you start looking at issues like tax reform and mortgage interest deduction and those kinds of things, and it's just not clear. I mean, with respect to MID, it's a bipartisan issue. People support the mortgage interest deduction, right? I mean, it's, and it never really was targeted at mortgage interest. It started way back in the 1930s when businesses had to pay interest. And so they essentially put into the tax code that consumer interest, and again, it was mostly people that had businesses, would be exempt from taxes, right? And then in 1986, when we had the first huge tax reform under Ronald Reagan, they got rid of all the deduction for consumer interest except the mortgage interest deduction. But they make this point in the Zillow book that let's understand that this wasn't in 1930. Everyone said subsidize home ownership. It was really subsidizing business, and then it morphed kind of over time. So all that being said, it's very important, and getting rid of it would be huge dislocations. Huge, yeah, huge. Yes?
You mentioned the increase in the interest rate won't have any impact on residential. What about like multifamily commercial property?
What I'm hearing is those loans are hard to get. that there's more of a lending problem there, so I think that would exacerbate it. I'm not as familiar with the commercial side. I know on the residential side, the level of rates is great, but the underwriting has been difficult, so raising rates a little bit isn't going to have a huge impact one way or the other. I'm not sure, maybe the commercial market is more sensitive to that. You know, most of those loans are, what, 10 years, and then they roll them over? So I don't really know. Maybe there's someone in the audience that's more familiar with that than I am.
Most of them are about 5 to 7 in commercial.
Yeah.
And so they're very sensitive to interest rates because they're just, cap rates.
Right, right.
Cap rates are compressed right now, so they'll have to go up as interest rates go up.
So it'll have more of an impact on commercial.
If you work the river, it's off to go down, so their cap rate.
Right. So it'll have a bigger impact in commercial than it would on residential. Yeah, that makes sense to me. All right, well, thank you all very much. Have a good year.
You have not filled
I know
out
you're
your,
tired of talking. Are you familiar with reset?
With what?
Reset.
No.
Okay, so basically I'm concerned about the debt as a percentage